Hello, good afternoon. Hello again. Okay, we have with us Professor Gordon Mathews. As I mentioned before, it's a privilege for us to have Professor Gordon Mathews. He's Professor of Anthropology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's a specialist on cultural globalization. He has done field work on Japan, on Hong Kong, on China, on US. He works on globalization, also on, the lecture that he delivered before having lunch was about death, life after death. He works also on spiritual matters, on several topics. Actually, Professor Mathews is going to talk now about Ghetto at the center of the world, Chungking mentions on Hong Kong. So let's go to start. Just saying thank you so much, Professor Mathews, for being here today, and when you want.
Okay, this topic is completely different from what I talked about before lunch, so you won't recognize this at all from what we talked about earlier. This is a different world. I'm talking about Ghetto at the center of the world, Chungking Mansions, Hong Kong. Now, this is Chungking Mansions. It's a building right in the heart of downtown Hong Kong that is probably the most globalized building in the world. It's where people from sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and other areas seek their fortunes through temporary employment and low-budget transnational trade. It's a surprisingly big place, 90 guest houses or hotels, 380 businesses in all, 4,000 to 5,000 people staying in a cramped area of 100 meters square, rising 17 stories. There is no other building in the world quite like Chungking Mansions in the intensity of global interactions taking place under one roof. There certainly are globalized places in the world, as you all know. There are globalized neighborhoods. I mean, look at Raval, for example, right here. But in terms of one building being the center of so much going on, I think this is unique. Chungking Mansions is a ghetto at the center of the world. It's a home for South Asians and Africans in Chinese Hong Kong, a node of the developing world in Hong Kong. And that's what's really key, that this is a heart of the developing world in a center of the developed world. This is where poor people go to the rich world. And prices are amazingly cheap, obviously, enabling these people to be there. Many Hong Kong people are afraid to enter the building, partly because of Chinese racism, partly because of simple fear of the other. My students, for example, have often never been to this building. And you look up Chinese language websites and they say things like, I walked by Chungking Mansions and there were lots of black people. Oh, God, I mean, that's what you see. And, yeah. Chungking Mansions is a world center of low-end globalization. The transnational flow of people and goods involving relatively small amounts of capital and informal, semi-legal, or illegal transactions commonly associated with the developing world. This is globalization experienced by most of the world's people. And by the way, this is a general problem in much of the globalization literature. People think of globalization in terms of high-end multinational companies. McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Sony, and so on, Nokia. But in fact, in 70, 80% of the world, globalization is a matter of small traders buying a few hundred mobile phones, for example, or a few kilograms of clothing, carrying them back to their home country and selling them in markets. That's the way globalization works. Certainly in Chungking Mansions, that's what we see. Now, this is a subway map in Hong Kong, a metro map, and the interesting thing about this is the peninsula here, over to your right, the peninsula is probably the most expensive hotel in Hong Kong. Chungking Mansions is right here. You can see it right up there, and it's right next to the Holiday Inn. Now, the Holiday Inn charges Hong Kong $2,000 a night. Chungking Mansions charges US $100 a night, or 150, or maybe 200 in especially fancy hotels. So the gap is extraordinary. This is incredibly expensive real estate. A new shopping mall has just opened right over here, right over there. This building, this battered building, is in an extraordinarily expensive place, and yet this building continues. Here's what it looks like. You have really fancy buildings to the right and to the left. You got fancy billboards down here, but when you look up, this is what you see. And you don't see buildings like this in this part of Hong Kong, except for this one building, which is famous. And when you get to the entrance of the building, the entrance, by the way, is right down just above that bus, you can see it. When you get to the entrance, you can see people like you don't see elsewhere in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is 95% Chinese, but not in Chungking Mansions, where Chinese don't go. Basically, you see Pakistanis, Indians, Africans. Those are the dominant ethnic groups, but also people from everywhere in the world. But again, this does not look like Hong Kong. Now, how did this building come about? Well, it was built in 1962, and it was intended for the well-off, for the rich. Largely because Hong Kong in 1962 was not a very rich place, and so when you built a 17-story building, it was truly a luxury place. But from the start, it had no unified ownership and rapidly began falling apart. By the late 60s, it was a center for American GIs, American Army men, who left Vietnam and were looking for rest and relief, and all the whores, all the sex workers were in Chungking Mansions. That's what it was used for. By the 1970s, Lonely Planet, which you guys are probably quite aware of, that series began to be published, and they said, if you go to Hong Kong, the one place to stay in is Chungking Mansions! Exclamation mark. Because it's so cheap. And, you know, I was there in 1983, and, you know, it was just a bunch of white people like me with very long hair smoking dope all day. That was what the building was then. It fell apart more and more, partly because to make a lot of money in Chungking Mansions, the best thing to do would be take your flat, and it used to be many private flats, and make it into a guest house. When you do that, you divide a few rooms into many small rooms. Each room has to have its own television, its own air conditioner, and so the electrical burden gets really high. By the late 80s, you had fires happening a great deal. By the 90s, somebody died there. And we lost power for 10 days. Murders in the 2000s, and this is part of much of the bad reputation of the building. I misspoke. Death from fires in 88, in 93, a loss of power for 10 days, murders running all through, but particularly the early 2000s, numbers of murders there. And in Hong Kong, there were so many newspaper headlines saying, tear down Chungking Mansions, get rid of this building. By 2005, closed-circuit TV cameras were installed throughout the building, making it much safer. And it is a reasonably safe place now, but still, most of what goes on in Chungking Mansions is not legal, not fully legal. And that's the underlying fact of the place. Low-end globalization is mostly not legal for a variety of reasons. Now, why is Chungking Mansions a center of low-end globalization? The first reason is that it's an extraordinarily cheap place to stay. Again, you can get a room there. You guys would be traveling as tourists. You might have to pay Hong Kong $200, which would be roughly, 20 euros, I guess. And, you know, that's quite cheap. Can I stay in Barcelona for 20 euros? Probably not, but there may be a youth hostel. It's just an amazingly cheap place. Why? Well, because the African traders and South Asian traders who come can't afford anything else. And the guest house owners know this. The guest house owners know they can make money by keeping prices cheap. So the usual rules don't apply. The usual rules are, you know, build a guest house, make it fancier, upgrade it. It wouldn't work in Chungking Mansions because you'd lose your entire customer base. So keep it cheap, keep large numbers of people coming through, and make a lot of money. The second reason for Chungking Mansions to be a center of low-end globalization is Hong Kong's ease of entry. Usually, developing world peoples can't come to the developed world without a visa. If any of anybody from Africa or South Asia tries to go to Japan, tries to go to Australia, tries to go to the US, probably Spain too, you need a visa. But not in Hong Kong. They'll take people from a variety of countries and give them a 14-day or a 30-day or a 90-day entry. Why? It's because the tourist dollars are valuable to Hong Kong. So they don't worry too much about this. But this means that if you're from Tanzania, if you're from Kenya, if you're from India, go to Chungking Mansions. And I might mention, people know this. Go to Kathmandu, go to Kampala, go to Karachi, and I've been to these cities and asked, mention Hong Kong. The first thing people say is Chungking Mansions. They know this. The third reason for the emergence of Chungking Mansions as a center of low-end globalization is China. China is well known for making all kinds of goods, but particularly China makes really, really cheap goods. Used goods, copy goods, shoddy goods from the first world. So, nobody can afford a Nokia phone. Nobody can afford a Samsung phone. Anybody can afford a China copy of a Nokia phone, a China copy of a Samsung phone. That's the mechanism we see here, and it works. I stayed in Chungking Mansions 1 to 2 nights a week, May 2006 to September 2009. And now, too, I go every week. I teach a class of asylum seekers in Chungking Mansions every week. Not while I'm here, but still, every week I'm there. I wander through the building talking to everyone I meet, and I go to a stairway to record all I can remember every hour. For those of you who are going to be doing anthropology research, the single key is a small tape recorder. Because you can't stick a tape recorder in front of people. They won't know what to make of it. Instead, talk to people, and then, before you forget, go tape. Now, this is problems, because some people saw me recording and began to think I was a CIA agent. I told them, if I was CIA, I'd have better things to do than go to Chungking Mansions, but you see the issue here. Now, Chungking Mansions is not dangerous. It's a little more dangerous for females, because it is an overwhelmingly male place. It's 90–95% male, and the assumption is that young women wouldn't be there unless they were interested in sex, which is completely misguided, but especially many Muslims do seem to have this assumption, and it's fairly powerful. I know this because I've had female students work as research assistants, and it's very, very hard. I'd like to talk to you about trade. Let's do it up in my room. Yeah. Still, at least for me as a white male, not Chinese looking like an undercover cop, or not Indian looking like a business competitor, Chungking Mansions is a remarkably friendly place in which to do research. I'm very surprised by how much people tell me about all of their illegal activities, but they do. My book comes out next month, Ghetto at the Center of the World, Chungking Mansions, Hong Kong, describing all of this. And I've tried to write this in a way that doesn't use too much very detailed anthropological theory, but instead reaches out to a broad audience of intelligent readers who can make sense of what I'm trying to say about this building, because this is important, I think. Here's a typical picture of Chungking Mansions. You see these Muslim traders, presumably Pakistani, this African guy probably buying wholesale shoes, many of the shopkeepers here, mobile phones, the various goods for sale here. And let me now talk about the people in Chungking Mansions. And what I'm going to do is talk about the people for a while, and then in the last part of the talk, I will talk about theorizing Chungking Mansions and how you can take a place like this and look at it in a larger world schema. The majority of traders are African, but traders come from all over the world. They buy goods in Hong Kong or in China and sell them in their home country. Not always. You do have some Africans who bring gems and sell gems in Hong Kong or China. But 95% of traders specifically want to buy goods, all kinds of goods. They deal in mobile phones, clothing, watches, electronic goods, computers, building materials, furniture, used car parts, everything, often all mixed in one shipment. For example, one trader I know says he deals in used cars. What he really does is buy 2 used cars, put them in a container, and cut out the gas tank and fill the gas tank with mobile phones. Because then customs back in his home country will never know the mobile phones. And so he can bring in several hundred mobile phones without being taxed. So that's his dodge. Many, many other ways of doing it. But the point is, South Chinese factories make all this stuff, and they're brought in. Some of these traders carry goods in their luggage, up to 32 kilos. Others use air freight or rent or share containers. Generally, for mobile phones or clothing, it's easier to carry. And every guest house in Chungking Mansions has a scale, 32 kilo, because that's as much as airlines will let you take in, and people calculate in great detail how to do this. Okay? But if it's things like car parts, obviously you can't carry them. So many of these traders travel into South China on visas they obtain in Chungking Mansions. Others do their buying and selling in Hong Kong. Now, China has a very bad reputation for trade. You have a very good chance of getting cheated. I just had a student who finished a dissertation on African traders in Guangzhou in South China. And if you buy clothing, you can do it there because it's hard to get cheated with clothing unless you're really stupid. You watch them pack it. You watch every step of the way. Mobile phones, it's very easy to get cheated because you often can't tell what goes in them unless you're an electronic specialist. And so generally the rule of thumb is buy phones in Hong Kong, buy clothing in China. But it depends on the trader and the network of connections the trader has and how much they can trust those connections. Problems of customs and borders. Now, one fact about low-end globalization is almost as a rule, you have to cheat. Look at Nigeria. Nigeria does not allow clothing to be imported because Nigeria wants to keep its own clothing industry. But Nigeria doesn't have a clothing industry. So if it weren't for these traders, nobody would have any clothing. But the law says clothing is illegal. So the only thing traders can do is bribe. And the mechanism of doing this is very interesting. You don't pay money directly because it might get filmed. You simply leave, several hundred naira off in a corner here, and then after you're gone, the customs person goes, and that's the way it works. Every different country has its own mechanisms of this, but you've got to do this. Transactions are most often in cash. I have been in Chungking Mansion sitting next to a guy, and he has pulled out 30,000 US dollars. I have never held 30,000 US dollars in my entire life until I held his money, which he gave to me. Hey, hold this money so you can see it. But this has to be cash because many of the African countries particularly, the banks aren't trustworthy. And nobody trusts credit cards or letters of credit. So cash economy. Cash economy in many different currencies. Euros you can deal with there, Chinese yuan, Japanese yen. These traders, pretty much as a rule, are the elite in their home countries, simply because they have the money to come to Hong Kong and do business. But about half of traders fail and never return. It's an incredibly dangerous business to get into because if you get cheated, you're done. And over again, the story is a family pools together all their money to send their son to, from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania to Hong Kong. The guy plays around, he makes a deal, loses money, he comes home with only a few $100s, shame. Whereas the successful ones come back over and over and can make quite a great deal of money. Some commentary from traders I've talked to. If I pay customs in my country, I lose everything. If you buy 100 mobile phones, you must give up 50. You have to cheat instead. It's the only possible way. Yeah. West African trader. In Hong Kong customs, I was searched for drugs. I told the customs officer, do you think I'm stupid? If I wanted to smuggle drugs, I wouldn't have them in my luggage. I'd get a Chinese girl to take them in. And he would. And that's the way a successful trader would work. Central African trader. As a rule, every buyer of mobile phones knows what a real phone and a copy phone is, but no seller can ever say that. In Chungking Mansions, the word for copy is China-made. So, if you're buying phones, I've heard this conversation over and over again because I worked in a phone stall for several months, that you'll say, okay, I've got Nokia 6200, I can give this for you for $240, this is used, B grade, that's too expensive. Okay, 60, wham. All you got to do is say 60, you know it's a China copy. And buyer and seller know this. Nobody ever uses the word fake or copy. China-made they may use if the buyer is particularly naive, but everybody knows this. West African trader. I mix them, real and copy. I sell the copies to people off in their villages who don't know any better. I sell the real ones to people I know. I sell copies much cheaper. They work at first, but they break awfully quickly. Yeah, no doubt so. Depending on the grade of copy you buy, it's complicated. East African trader. Nobody in my country can buy an original phone by a famous company. It's too expensive. My copies show them good things. We traders take the world to Africa. And, I argued in Shanghai about 2 weeks ago that the major contribution of China to globalization is to provide cheap fakes. The Chinese students weren't very happy about that. But that's true. That's what it is. And this trader may be right. You can't buy a real Nokia. You can't buy a real Samsung. So, if the Chinese make a copy and it's labeled Nokia or Samsung, yeah, maybe it breaks quickly, but that's the best you can enjoy of globalization until you get richer. And many Africans aren't that rich yet. So, here's a typical Chungking Mansion scene. This guy here in his suit, he's not dressed that way because he always does. This is an advertisement. He has clothes like this made in Hong Kong to take back to West Africa. By wearing this, other traders will look at it and say, "Where did you get that?" "My company makes it." Wham! Money. Another scene of what goes on. More business in Chungking Mansions. This guy in the middle is a building guard. But the building guards are interesting because they don't speak English and the traders don't speak Chinese. And, they're all speaking in battered English to one another, so nobody communicates, but it seems to work. This is an interesting picture because here these African traders are dealing in phones, buying it from this Pakistani guy. They don't want to be photographed. Look at that guy's expression. I could have gotten beaten up for taking this picture. But the point is that by carrying all these phones, that's a lot of phones. These are several tens of thousands of phones in these boxes. That's a lot of money being traded here, even if these are cheap copy phones, no doubt. I think these are going to Lagos, Nigeria. Now, this is phone cards. And phone cards are extremely interesting because the rule is the richer the country, the cheaper the mobile phone connection. The poorer the country, the more expensive. So, you look at here. China, 500 minutes you can buy for 50 Hong Kong dollars, or about, €6. USA, 500 minutes. Canada, 500 minutes. Nigeria, only 90 minutes. Mali, only 25 minutes. And that's greatly unfair, obviously. But it's also true the mobile phone is what makes low-end globalization possible. A trader can fly into here, get on the phone back to suppliers back in Africa, talk to suppliers and talk to sellers in China. Wham! The business can be done rather quickly this way, although again you may get cheated. Next group, restaurant business and guest house owners, managers, and employees. Now, owners and managers are often from mainland China. They were people who came into Hong Kong maybe 20 or 30 years ago and bought real estate in the one place they could afford. But there are increasing numbers of South Asians. Some employees are Hong Kong residents, but more are on tourist visas they renew by returning home every 2 months. Many are from Kolkata. I flew back to Kolkata with a temporary worker, and it was amazing. This one Calcutta neighborhood of Kidarpur, everybody there seemed to know me because I'd been in Chungking Mansions. And so I'd see this guy, "Hi, remember me? I'm from the 10th floor. Remember me? I work on the 13th floor, B block." The whole community is based on Chungking Mansions, and the key is you can make more money as an illegal employee in Chungking Mansions than you can make back home as a civil servant. And so this is an enormous chance to make money and take it home. And you can always tell some of the young men who've been in Chungking Mansions because they bought new motorcycles with their money. And an amazing scene, I remember one young man with his new motorcycle followed by about half a dozen teenagers. And they looked at him like he was a movie star. Oh man, this guy. These employees are paid very little, around Hong Kong 3,000 per month, or again, euros, 400 a month probably, or 300 a month. But traders pay for much of their air tickets. By carrying clothes and other goods back, you can pay for most of your ticket. So the flying back and forth doesn't tend to cost all that much. Why do these temporary employees come? They have no job prospects at home, and Hong Kong tolerates them, and they're impossible to catch. Police can't do very much about these guys because anytime police enter Chungking mansions, get on the phone and call your friend. Everybody knows. And if you're working illegally, they can't catch you because I'm behind a counter here. As soon as the police come in, well, I get up and I sit down here. Oh, hi, you're a policeman. I'm a tourist. No one will know. And so really, it's almost impossible. Also, everybody knows who the undercover police are, including me. I love to come up in Chungking mansions to an undercover policeman. Hi, you're a policeman? I'm a professor. Glad to meet you. You know, so the police, they're there for show. They don't do anything here, really. Without these tourist visa employees, many Chungking mansions businesses could no longer afford to exist. These tourist visa employees are essential. They're what make it work. Commentary. Store employee. Yes, I was surprised when I first got to Chungking mansions. It was not like Hong Kong, but like Kolkata. Guest house manager. Triad societies, Chinese gangsters, have never had the chance to penetrate Chungking mansions. When you're local Chinese and walk into Chungking mansions, you're so obvious you can never hide yourself. The gangsters would love to get into Chungking mansions, but they can't possibly do it because they don't speak English, and nobody will give them the time of day. So they've never been able to get in. There have been Pakistani gangsters, but no mainland Chinese or Chinese. Guest house manager. Business is much harder than in the past. People don't stay for a long time anymore because of the China lure. Why stay in Hong Kong when they can buy in China? And that's certainly true, but China, again, is a much harder place to do business, even though the chance to make a huge profit is there. And so Hong Kong is sort of this island next to China, but still not part of China, where you can make money, but you can't make a killing the way you can in Guangzhou if you're lucky. But you also are less likely to get completely cheated. Pakistani Muslim phone store manager to an African custom. My friend, you are a Christian, and yet you are causing me all this trouble. I must rewrite all the invoices. Why do you do this to me if we are both men of God? And this is amazing because in a globalized environment like this, you have such different people conversing. And it's so much fun to watch an African trader from Mali, for example, or from Zimbabwe or any number of places talk to a Pakistani phone merchant, and these guys have to negotiate in about 20 seconds. And they've got to navigate the cross-cultural understandings and misunderstandings very quickly. Hong Kong policeman to young Indian man. You're not doing anything bad, are you? Except for working illegally. If you're not doing anything bad, you'll be okay here. Now, the police tell me often that they're worried about drug dealing, they're worried about violence, they don't like prostitution much. But basically, if somebody's working illegally, so what? And that's what this policeman meant. We'll tolerate this. Store employee to me. Please tell me, is there any possible way I could get Hong Kong residency? That's the dream of these guys. I tell him only one way, get married. Find a Hong Kong girl. My best friend in Chungking mansions is getting married actually a few days ago. May 27th he got married. And I wished I could have been at his wedding. He married a woman who I think is mentally handicapped because the only way he could get the chance to remain in Hong Kong is to get married. And he's a Pakistani man. He's powerfully ambitious. This is his best chance. Now, he treats her nicely, but it's a very strange equation. I need this Hong Kong ID card. This is the only way I can get it. No regular person would ever want to marry somebody like me. This is a friend of mine in a sweet shop. Many Indian stores in Chungking mansions. This is not the person I just talked about. And Tayaji Islamic Book Center, a very interesting place to buy Qurans in. It also is useful for money laundering, I hear. And a typical store scene of the building with Chinese walking through, but numbers of Africans and others buying phones here from these Pakistani sellers. And a quieter time here. Notice 100% halal. That's extremely important in Chungking mansions. Now, the next group to talk about are asylum seekers. There are some 7,000 asylum seekers in Hong Kong. mostly from South Asia and Africa. Many congregate in Chungking mansions. There are NGOs in Chungking mansions serving them. They are people who are fleeing persecution in their own countries, although some are real and some are deemed not real. It's a confusing matter. They await recognition of refugee status from the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which grants such status often after years of waiting to a small minority. Many are turning to the Hong Kong government now, it's complicated, but the Hong Kong government is a signatory to Convention Against Torture, so if you've been tortured, maybe you can get status that way. It's extremely difficult. Almost nobody ever manages to do this. I flew to Africa to visit an asylum seeker friend of mine's family, and I have been talking to the UNHCR for the last 2 years. I've got clear, obvious reason to show, I can prove to anybody that he's an asylum seeker. He was threatened with death. He happens to be from Uganda, which is a friend of the US. So, he'll never get it. It's disgusting. I'm completely disgusted by the behavior of all of these, and I'm writing a paper now about how developed world treaties are basically designed to keep the poor out. You know, so let's have this ghetto of the rich. That's their whole purpose. Asylum seekers are not allowed to work and must live on charity in Hong Kong. Very little. They get just enough to survive at the most minimal level. Many, however, do work. Many asylum seekers are fake in the sense that they simply seek better economic opportunities for themselves. Many are quite real, fleeing torture or death threats. But the term real and fake are misleading. Let me give you an example. A good friend of mine says, I had to leave Ghana because my neighbor threatened to kill me. It was a land dispute. But his neighbor was the same ethnicity as him. The UNHCR accepts asylum claims if it's a struggle over ethnicity, politics, or religion. Otherwise, it's not real. So, if his neighbor had been a Muslim and he had been a Christian, great, you're in. But because his neighbor was also a Muslim, because his neighbor was also Hausa, wham, it doesn't count, sorry, stay back. That's what we see. You can't get a restraining order. You can't call the police in these developing countries. It doesn't work. It's often assumed that fake asylum seekers work. Real asylum seekers are afraid to work because if they're caught, they'll be deported back to their home countries and imprisoned or perhaps killed. But the situation is much more complicated. Many people work because if they don't work, they can't possibly support their families back home. Some I know don't work because they're lazy. They'd rather get drunk. And that happens too. It's an extremely complicated situation, and I've been writing newspaper articles in Hong Kong saying that the government policy is the exact opposite of what it should be because it rewards fake asylum seekers and hurts real ones. But commentary. South Asian asylum seeker. How can I prove I deserve refugee status? I have a bullet in my hip. Here's the x-ray. That doesn't prove anything. That just proves somebody shot you, but you could have shot yourself. Sorry. African asylum seeker. My brother-in-law has tried to kill me several times. Shouldn't I be able to get refugee status? Nope. That won't do it. African asylum seeker. The UNHCR teaches asylum seekers to become beggars. Yeah. African asylum seeker. My mother gave me to a Christian sect that was going to castrate me on my 21st birthday to give me to God. I escaped, went to the jungle, and met 2 Australians who saw the vial of diamonds my mother had given me. I remember being locked in the hold of a ship, drugged. I woke up in Hong Kong with no money and no passport. Yeah, right. This guy, I told him, you have seen too many bad movies. No, invent a different story. This is not going to work. I don't think he believed me, and he was deported shortly thereafter. African asylum seeker. My country's government is terrible. They will kill me if I go back, but I love my country. And I'm always amazed by how much many of these asylum seekers love their countries that have, after all, tried to kill them, in many cases. My personal estimate is that probably 60 or 70% of asylum seekers are primarily economic. And maybe 20%, maybe 25% have political reasons for fleeing. Bly, don't write that down. I'll get killed if anybody knows this, but okay. Finally, tourists here among these groups. Tourists come to Chungking mansions for adventure, especially Japanese and Europeans, for a taste of home, especially South Asians and China, and for economic reasons, especially mainland Chinese who may have no idea what Chungking Mansions is. Japanese tourist. I come to Chungking Mansions because it's ethnic chaos. And this guy, I mean, in basically mono-ethnic Japan, loved Chungking Mansions. He just would stand there looking, wow, all these people. This was paradise for him. American tourist. It's nicer now than in the 1980s. I'm disappointed. This guy was one of these hippies who smoked dope all the time, and now, I mean, it looks reasonably nice. So it's become middle class. Yeah. Mainland tourist. I didn't know there would be so many Africans here. It's horrible. Yeah. And you hear this from mainlanders because they look on the internet and find a website, and they're looking for a cheap hotel. But on the mainland, hotels are pretty cheap. And so they come to Chungking Mansions thinking that, hey, this must be a nice hotel, and they can't believe where they are. Another mainland tourist. I want to eat Chinese food, but I can't buy any here. Why not? Isn't Hong Kong part of China? Well, as I told her, Hong Kong's part of China, but Chungking Mansions is not part of Hong Kong. It's the developed world in Hong Kong. Another story that I didn't write here was the mainland woman who came in wearing a short skirt, the kind of skirt she would wear going to discos, but in Chungking Mansions everybody assumed she was a sex worker. And so all these Africans and Indians coming up, how much, how much, how much? You know, and you could see the cross-cultural problems that would be created from that. Another picture. This is the entrance to Chungking Mansions. This woman may be a flight attendant, because many flight attendants come to Chungking Mansions because the rates, the exchange rates are the cheapest around. Most other people don't know that. But this is waiting for the elevator, and one of the great experiences in Chungking Mansions is the long wait for the elevator. There's a total of 5 different elevators going up the 3 different blocks in the building, and the elevators are incredibly crowded. So you have 8 people in a really tiny space, and you're desperate to manage to have the elevator not stop. And so you raise your hand and wiggle so that the alarm won't go off, saying there's too much weight in the room. Now, the last part of the talk, for the next 15 or so minutes, I want to theorize Chungking Mansions a bit and talk to you about how you might theorize the place. And there's 4 different approaches I want to come up with, 2 of them being more macroscopic and 2 being more microscopic. This is, of course, the great anthropological challenge, because anthropologists have to do 2 different things. There's the field work. And the field work is just where you talk to people, you get to know them. That's a challenge. But beyond that, how can you make it significant? What can you do to make it more than a tourist guide or an interesting building? One theory to use is world systems theory. Now, you guys probably know world systems theory of the core, the semi-periphery, and the extreme periphery. The core being the United States, Japan, probably South Korea, certainly Europe. The semi-periphery being the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, and in this case, definitely China. And the extreme periphery being Africa, some Latin American countries, although not many now, some South Asian countries like Nepal, and so on. Many of the traders who come to Chungking Mansions are from the extreme periphery. And in Chungking Mansions, we see traders from the extreme periphery, Africa, traveling to the semi-periphery, China, to buy used or copy goods from the core, Japan or Western Europe. These traders can't afford the core. Their customers back in Africa, the buyers of these goods, can't afford the core, so they buy cheap goods from the periphery. As I say here, traders take the simulacra, the copies of the real goods of the core, fakes manufactured in the semi-periphery, to sell to the desirous and impoverished consumers of the extreme periphery. That's the mechanism here. Now, my estimate, based on talking to a lot of phone store operators in sort of secret tones, is that 20% of the mobile phones now in use in sub-Saharan Africa have passed through Chungking Mansions. I can tell you in detail how I arrived at this, but looking at the overall figures in Africa, coupled with what I know of phone figures in Chungking Mansions, this seems to be a reasonable figure. Many traders have told me it's probably too conservative. It's probably more like 30 or 40. But in any case, 20 is what I can vouch for. The real question is, to what extent do the traders in Chungking Mansions exploit their customers, and to what extent do they expand their imaginations? I don't know. You can go either way with this. It's hard to know. I do know that most buyers know the difference between a real phone and a fake phone. But like traders everywhere, there's the constant temptation to cheat and rip people off. How much can they get away with it? Much depends upon how developed the market is in a given society, and therefore how sophisticated the buyers will be. It's always buyer beware, and you get cheated if you're not. But again, how this ultimately plays out, I don't know. I've interviewed numbers of African legislators as well as traders trying to get at this. And the legislators say that this trade is evil. The traders, as a rule, say it's good. So, the temporary workers in Chungking mansions come to the core, Hong Kong, from the periphery, Kolkata, for higher wages. Their Hong Kong work may be tedious and humiliating, but they're heroes back home in Kolkata. The friend I stayed with in Kolkata bought his own motorcycle, he refurbished the family house, he paid for 3 of his sisters' weddings. He is the family breadwinner and hero from mopping floors in Chungking mansions. The asylum seekers are treated badly in Hong Kong, but they have come because they're provided with at least minimal means by which to live. Many of the asylum seekers I know talk about how terrible their lives are. I say, yes, but you're not starving to death. You can survive. No one is trying to kill you. You can walk around. You can go to the library. They don't believe me, but... Yeah. Tourists come to Chungking mansions for a glimpse of the exotic periphery while still enjoying the safety of the core. And this is true particularly of Europeans, Americans, and Japanese, many of whom wouldn't really go to India or Africa. They'd be afraid to go to Africa. But Chungking mansions is a taste of that world in a world where law is followed. And I guarantee you, if there's any violence or robbery in Chungking mansions, police are there within 1 minute. Police take that stuff very seriously. So that it is a safe version of the developing world for people from the developed world. And even the hippies enjoy this advantage of the safety of the developed world, even when they're smoking dope. So. Now, another macroscopic element here to think about, my second one, is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, as you probably know, is a philosophy emphasizing the market as the ultimate arbiter of value. Hong Kong epitomizes this. How? Well, look at Hong Kong's largely open visa policy. I mean, Hong Kong is generally thought to be the world's freest economy. The economists keep saying the world's freest economy year after year, and it probably is. An open visa policy. Why? You can make money off people. Don't have the state restrict anybody. Hong Kong's mostly open borders. You know, the border between Hong Kong and China, yes, if you get caught carrying copy goods over the border, you could get them taken away, but the chances are about the same as getting struck by lightning. It doesn't happen very often. Chungking mansions laissez-faire law enforcement. What goes on at Chungking mansions, except for overt robbery and violence, is tolerated by police. It's business as usual. What I tell my friends in Chungking mansions is, if the police pick you up, pretend like you don't speak English. Because there's no way the police can afford for a Hausa interpreter, or a Luo interpreter, or even an Urdu interpreter is hard to get. And so the police always say, look, we just don't want to bother with this stuff. Unless there's a robbery or violence, yes, we will. Otherwise, no. And this is the way Chungking mansions works. But the surprising thing is, Chungking mansions is a fairly peaceful place. Now, neoliberalism has a bad press in anthropology. Everybody hates neoliberalism. It's the market destroying the state, destroying indigenous cultures. Yes, it is. And in many places, neoliberalism is a terrible thing. Chungking mansions, too, as I'll talk about shortly, but it is surprising that Chungking mansions is peaceful in part because of this. I remember talking to a Pakistani trader working for Indians. And I asked him, look, you're working for Indians. Don't you hate these guys? And he said, well, I hate them and they hate me, but we can't afford to fight. We're both here to make money. What can I say? That's the line of Chungking mansions. Now, ethnic tensions. There is generally not much ethnic tension in Chungking mansions between South Asians and Africans or Muslims and Christians, although occasionally outsiders arrange such tension. The last time this happened was several weeks ago when there was a large fight between Pakistanis and Africans. What happened was the Chinese gangs wanted to sell heroin. They did this on one side of the building, and then they told the Pakistani that the Africans had been insulting his Hong Kong girlfriend. The African got furious. He went and punched a Pakistani. The police all came and surrounded them, so the heroin dealers had a free rein for an hour because no police were around to watch them. That's how ethnic tensions get played with here. Class tensions. The gap between the well-off and the poor, between the owners and the temporary workers, between the large entrepreneurs and the small traders is enormous at Chungking Mansions, although most view it as a fact of life rather than an injustice. One thing to remember is, in most places, the rich and the poor are separate. They never cross paths. In Chungking Mansions, no. The shop owner may be right next to an illegal asylum seeker worker and make 30 times more money than this illegal worker. But the illegal workers, when I ask them, I say, aren't you angry? No, I want to be like him. That's what you see. The underlying reason for the lack of class tension in Chungking Mansions and the apparent success of neoliberalism in creating peace is that Chungking Mansions is a club of the developing world successful. Why? Anybody who can afford to get on an airplane and fly to Chungking Mansions is rich by developing world standards. Even the asylum seekers. I know many Somali asylum seekers. But come on, Somali asylum seekers die all the time when they get in a raft and try and go to Saudi Arabia. These guys didn't do this. Instead, their families got US $7,000, put them on a plane, flew them to Hong Kong so that they could get government help. So even the asylum seekers, even the most poor, are doing very well by developing world standards. Now, who suffers from Chungking Mansions? The consumers may well suffer. So clearly there are people who suffer. But at least in Chungking Mansions, again, this is a club of the third world rich, so to speak, even if they don't look rich by Hong Kong standards. That's a major reason why neoliberalism seems to work here. You know, if you got together a club of the richest magnates in Barcelona, they wouldn't have much to complain about the capitalist order. This isn't quite the same as that, but still, this is one reason for the comparative peace, I think. Microscopics. Most globalization theory is macroscopic, but in Chungking Mansions, theory needs to be applied very close to the ground as well. You probably know about Arjuna Pattarai's 5 scapes. He's written about ethnoscapes, mediascapes, idioscapes, financescapes, and technoscapes. But he writes about them on a country-to-country basis. What if you look at this actually on a person-to-person basis, at a really individual basis? You can see an amazing amount and learn an amazing amount. For example, ethnoscapes. Consider the careful strategies of self-presentation used by the new African buyer of phones from a Pakistani-run stall. Look at this. This woman dealing with this Pakistani guy. How does she guarantee she won't get cheated? She's got to present herself in about 20 seconds to indicate to this guy that she knows what she's talking about. She, in turn, needs to fool him. These guys are so smart. This guy, for example, might say to her, she might say, I want this brand of phone. He'll say, have you heard of this other brand of phone? No. Raise the price, $10 a phone. You've got her. She shows her ignorance. It's that sly. And it's amazingly quick. I know from working in these places. It's incredibly quick how these guys can make the judgments. So the ethnoscape is a way in which one person will get incredibly rich, another person will lose everything, all on the basis of this really quick performance. Another ethnoscape, in front of Chungking Mansions at night. You know, you've got these African guys often trying to pick up Hong Kong girls or Filipina girls and so on. An amazing scene. What goes on at night? Saturday night in front of Chungking Mansions is so amazing because next to it are a lot of fashionable bars. You see Hong Kong people leaving these bars, girls in short skirts and drunk European guys and so on. And then the Africans are seated here, the South Asians there, just looking at this procession. It's amazing. And what they say to each other and the mutual misunderstandings. Technoscapes, the complex jockeying over phone model information that I've mentioned. Financescapes, the prevalence of cash, but no credit cards. Idioscapes. Consider one story here, the changing attitudes of an Indian Muslim tout towards Russian sex workers. I once saw, when I began my research in Chungking Mansions, an amazing sight of 2 very blonde women with bare backs walking into Chungking Mansions, instantly followed by, it must have been 50 or so Pakistani and African men just sort of going like that. I was staring too. I was in a restaurant. And a young Pakistani man said, he put his hand over my eyes and said, "Mister, don't look. They are bad women." Well, I sort of looked, and I looked at him, and he was looking. But then the same thing happened a month later. And I said, "Look, a month ago you put your hand over my eyes. Why don't you do this now?" And he said, "They have to make a living like I have to make a living." So his mind had been changed here, clearly, into this neoliberal way of thinking. He'd lost his Muslim morals, really, to this new world, for better or for worse. And other examples, mediascapes, the battle over volume between Pakistani and Hong Kong stalls. You know, they both have their TVs on. Who gets to turn up volume louder? You know, that's the kind of thing that goes on a regular, daily basis. As well as the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics, where the Chinese were looking, "Wow, look at this." The Africans looked only at the opening ceremony when their country was shown. "Cameroon, yay!" And then back to ignore it. So. Yeah. Now, one other aspect of these microscopics, identity. How does Chungking Mansion change the people who stay there? This is my last theoretical element. For some, there's no apparent effect. An East African trader told me, "I come here only to make money. I don't have time to talk to people." Others hate Hong Kong and China for their racism. Why do they hate Africans? A complicated question, partly just because of ignorance of them. But a few are transformed. An East African trader said, "I am a Chinese with black skin." One of the funniest scenes I saw was two African guys just about to engage in a fist fight behind Chungking Mansions, where there's a whiskey stall and everybody drinks really cheap whiskey back there. And one guy was saying, "Hong Kong is better than China. In Hong Kong, we have human rights. We have freedom of information." The other African guy said, No, China's the mother of everything in Hong Kong. Hong Kong would be nothing without China." I first heard this without looking at them and assumed it was a Hong Kong person and a Chinese person arguing. It was two Africans. And they'd taken on these foreign identities and were arguing so much they were about to beat each other up. Wow. One temporary Indian worker I knew proclaimed, "I love Chungking Mansions. I ate sushi last night. I could never do that in Kolkata." Another said, "I hate Chungking Mansions. I will never come back. You can walk up to a girl and get her phone number. Hong Kong is immoral." He told me he wanted to live in Mecca, because in Mecca you can't walk up to a girl and get her phone number. Now, he had never done this. He was only imagining it, but nonetheless. The interesting question is, why are some people eager to enter the global cultural supermarket, which I've written another book about, while others resist it? This is a matter of individual psychology, but also of anthropology. Why are some people open to other cultures and others closed? You know, very interesting. It's hard to know. There's a religious factor in it, but it's a lot more complicated than that. This is one future anthropological question. As cultures become less pure, instead it becomes a matter of how do you shape yourself from a cultural supermarket in either conservative or liberal ways? How do you become a global citizen? That's the question that I saw in Chungking Mansions. Some final thoughts. Chungking Mansions is unique, but there are sites throughout the world of intense global micro-interactions that demand investigation. And I would call for anthropologists everywhere to look at some of these sites. Come on, you could go to Brighton in the UK. Some of you guys should be doing research in Raval here. That's waiting for one of you guys to go there. You know, and do it. I know you're East Asianists and not anthropologists necessarily, but that's a place waiting to be studied. China is often derided in Chungking Mansions for making cheap goods. But in fact, China is the motor of low-end globalization. Might this be China's major contribution to the 21st century, making copy goods? Maybe so. Maybe this is China's great basis of globalization. Europe didn't do it. Europe colonized without bringing the fruits of globalization. America didn't do it. Maybe that's what China's doing. Chinese hate to hear this, and when I gave this talk in Shanghai, they were very angry over this thought, but this may be China's major global contribution. And finally, Chungking Mansions will eventually be torn down, but all the world may become Chungking Mansions. Is Chungking Mansions the future of the world? I think it is. And it's the future because increasingly you're going to have people from the developing world coming to the developed world, wanting the fruits of the developed world. The developed world can try putting up walls everywhere. It can't win. You're going to have more and more places in Barcelona like Raval. You're going to have more and more places in London like Brixton. This is what the world's going to become. We better get used to it. And the final thought, If this is what the world becomes, I think it's a pretty good future. And my last optimistic slide hopefully will show that. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Mathews. It was an awesome and a great presentation. I have several questions, but first I want to open the floor, so go ahead.
First, I want to say that my English is not very good.
Okay.
But I
Hablo un
didn't-
poquito español, pero...
No, don't worry. I didn't understand you. You say that you have been living in these places.
Yeah.
And why? I don't understand. For business? For what?
No, I'm not a drug dealer. Okay, yeah.
What?
No, I'm not a drug dealer. Okay. An anthropologist needs to be...
For anthropology.
Yeah, for anthropology.
Okay.
Yeah, an anthropologist needs to be in the place. But that's a really good question. Many researchers don't spend enough time. I know a guy in Hong Kong, an African guy who is a scholar, a professor. He comes to Chungking Mansions and hands out a questionnaire.
Yeah.
And he gets the answers and leaves. He knows nothing. Because nobody writes true things on a questionnaire. They're not going to talk about this. The only way you find out things is to hang out for a very long time. Because at first, everyone thinks you're a policeman. They might think you're CIA. But eventually, they will indeed come to accept what you say you are. And that's when they begin telling you things. So I think to understand this building, you need 3 years of not just hanging out, an hour a day, but really being there. Now, I didn't live there permanently. I stayed there 1 to 3 nights a week. I mean, I am married, and my wife would have left me if I stayed 3 full years in Chungking Mansions, but I certainly was there a long time, and I learned a great deal from being there. For example, sex workers. Sex workers aren't going to talk to me if they think I'm a customer, but what if I'm in a room next to a sex worker? Well, if I get to know her, yeah, I can find out. One woman from Tanzania who told me she had a kid back home. She felt that in 4 years of sex work, she could make enough money to start a store back in Dar es Salaam. This was her dream. Very bourgeois. And very interesting. I hope she succeeds. I wouldn't have known that unless I'd been around her so much that she could talk to me, not as a potential customer, but, as just somebody, an anthropologist. So it takes time. That's the biggest thing about field work that so many people don't realize. It takes a hell of a lot of time, but only by spending that time and just hanging out with people, not asking interview questions, but just hanging out, talking about anything. That's what you have to do to learn enough information to really know what's going on.
So you think that, the next year I go to Hainan, and it's near to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Do you think this is a good idea, go a few days to Hong Kong to Chungking Mansion?
Well, if you do, you might change your field work. I mean, Hainan is a...
Just for knowing, not for make business, just
Okay.
for know it and know people, girls, I don't know.
Yeah, definitely hang out there. In fact, ask Bly, and when you come, let me know. You can attend my class of African asylum seekers. Definitely stay there a while. You'll love it. I mean, a lot of people do that. So yes, definitely come. You're invited. Please do. Yeah.
I will send him to you.
Okay, please do. Please do.
Right now.
What's your name, by the way? What's your name? What?
James in English,
Jaime. Hyman. Okay, I'll remember Hyman. Jaime, I'll remember that. Jaime. I'll remember. Okay, I got that. Yeah.
James, if you want.
Okay, guys, so you can see how complicated, how deep is this of the field work, no? More questions about, as you know, I say before the break, no? Professor Mathews is one of the leading specialists in East Asian studies on globalization, on cultural globalization. So don't refrain to ask also about cultural globalization, not only focus on Chungking Mansion, that is the topic that he is presenting today, but as he mentioned, and I mentioned before the break, he has also a book, the Cultural Global Supermarket, it's outstanding contribution on cultural globalization.
Hello again.
Yeah. Hey.
When you said before that maybe the biggest contribution of China, it's like providing cheap goods for like the rest of the world and people who cannot afford the real ones. Do you think that China will continue having this role? Because when I was a kid, everything cheap was made in Taiwan.
Yeah, yeah.
And before that moment, everything cheap was made in Japan.
Yeah.
Now it's made in China. Maybe, I don't know, in 20 years it would be made in Pakistan or I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think it will change?
Yeah, excellent question. It probably will change. Already now in Guangdong province, wages are beginning to become higher among workers there. No longer can they exploit workers because the workers won't take those jobs. This has been a big change in the last 2 years. It probably will change. One interesting thing about China is that the rule of law doesn't really apply. And so you can still have a factory that makes, I know one factory that makes real Nokias 9 to 5 and copy Nokias 5 to midnight. And you just switch, okay, copies now. You can do that, and the law enforcement isn't that strong if you pay the right people. At some point, that will probably give way. And I think you're right. It may move to where? Pakistan would be one guess. Vietnam is what I most often hear, but Vietnam's GDP is also going up. None of this stuff is permanent. I think the same thing that happened in Taiwan and in Japan of moving up the value chain will probably happen to China. The only reason why this will take a long time is that China is so big that you're going to have so much going on that can't be monitored by authorities. So I would guess another 20 or so years, you're going to have China as a leading source of copies. So if you're going to go into business, do it now, you could say. But eventually it will give way, and what country will be next? My African asylum seeker friends all say it's definitely going to be the Congo or someplace like that. Who knows? We'll see. But someplace will emerge, and China is pretty recent. I heard from a trader that even in 1995, the major place to go was Jakarta, Indonesia. And that lost its, and Mexico was pretty good too for having copies. So it lost all that because the economy of scale meant China could make this stuff much more cheaply than any of them could. We'll see what happens and how this works. But it definitely is a temporary matter rather than a permanent matter. No question about it.
Thank you.
Danny.
You've just portrayed an image of Chungking Mansions as utopia for the future or something, but that's an opinion from someone who is coming from the other side of the world. Yeah. And I just want to ask, what do Hong Kongese or Chinese anthropologists think about Chungking Mansions thing? As
a rule, they're afraid to go. They don't go. And they don't go for good reason, because any Chinese person of Chinese ethnicity would be rejected rather rapidly. They would assume they're a government agent of some sort. They're not coming in for good reason. Plus, just Chinese have a real antipathy for the place. Hong Kong is a small place, and so there are probably 25 anthropologists in Hong Kong. Of them, probably 15 are Hong Kong Chinese, and every one of them does not go and do research in Chungking Mansions. I got a large research grant to do this because Hong Kong Chinese were evaluating the research grant, and they thought I was incredibly brave. Well, no, I'm not particularly brave, but they were so terrified of the place. So, you know, it's really, you can't really even ask that question because they don't go in. It's also true that since Hong Kong has become part of China, there's much more emphasis among anthropologists and sociologists and others to emphasize belonging to China, the Chineseness of Hong Kong, aspects of Chinese in Hong Kong. This developing world population is not looked at very much, which is a real problem. Now, your question is a good one, because I am talking not about a utopia quite. I mean, I have talked about problems, but I have talked about a good side of it. And I've often thought about why. Certainly, early on I thought, am I romanticizing this place? Am I looking at it better than it is? But I realized, no, I'm not. It's just that, again, as I said earlier, these people are among the successful in their home countries. They're living out their country's dreams, in a sense. You know, you go to Africa and talk to young people, and as a rule, on the streets of Lagos or on the streets of Kampala, what you hear is, I want to leave. I want to go and become a business person. How can I do it? In a place like Lagos, you got people who serve as apprentices. They get maybe a $5,000 US lump sum for working for nothing for 5 years. With this money, what do? I'll go to Hong Kong. I'll go to China. I'll make it. And those you see in Chungking Mansions have. even if they're illegal immigrants there. And so that's one reason why you see a relatively cheery side of this. And even the people who have failed at it, well, they feel terribly distressed personally, but they know people who have made it. It's possible to do this in a way that really is difficult in many poor developing world places. I know from my own travels how much many poor young people really do feel this utter despair. And I guess you see a little bit of this in Barcelona, you know, the unemployed youth who dropped out of school who can't find a job. But it's really pervasive in much of the developing world. So those who can manage to go do see this as a beacon of hope rather than a hellhole, as many in Hong Kong and China do. Back, though, to your earlier point, because it's important. I've often wondered why nobody ever studied this. And the reason is because most anthropologists and most social scientists don't have very much imagination. That stuff comes right directly in front of them and they don't realize how interesting it is. But this place, I mean, what better place and easier place to study? It's remarkably simple and straightforward. Just go there. And, you know, right around any of you here, one of you guys go to Raval.
I think in Hong Kong, I didn't know about Chungking.
Yeah, they didn't tell you this, yeah. I'm surprised. For you, they would have had you stay there, though, no?
Sorry?
They would have had you stay in Chungking mansions, no? I mean, a lot of European guys like you.
I didn't know about it, so it's
Okay, okay. If you guys do go, by the way, the first thing that'll happen is you'll have about 5 Nepalese heroin addicts come up to you early on and say, hashish, hashish. Because the assumption is every young white person smokes hashish. You can say no, but that's the first thing that'll happen. If you do, it seems reasonably safe out back, but that's the instant assumption they make. That's their market research. And it's quite funny how this happens. This is only a small group there. I didn't talk about the heroin addicts in back, who are the sons of Nepalese Gurkhas. There's a whole lot of other different minor groups in this building that make it this incredible international scene. But next time you go, mention Chungking Mansions. You'll have a great time there. Just don't be afraid to talk to people, because a lot of people are. Talk to anybody you meet. They'll love to talk. And if you really want to be brave, what you need to do is go out back, go to the whiskey stall, where you can get a glass of whiskey for about 60 cents. Well less than €1. If you drink 3 of them, you'll die. But if you drink 1 or 2, you're okay. And just talk to the people hanging out there. Do it. Yeah.
I'll make you a call.
Okay. Please, you too. What's your name?
Danny.
Danny. Okay, Danny and Jaime, I'll expect you both, okay? Yeah.
Okay, we're organizing a flight, so more questions? More questions? Yeah, Aran?
Hi again.
Hi.
I can't stop thinking if this is a kind of illusion, in fact, because they are living a life emulating someone they are not, in fact, because they try to be rich because there is rich and there is people who is not rich.
Yeah.
And, this is
Well, interesting question. Remember, a lot of these guys come from middle-class families. They do come from wealth. So that I don't think most of these people are emulating anything. Let me give you one extreme example of this. I know one asylum seeker who was sleeping outside for a full year. And he slept near the Peninsula Hotel, that fancy, expensive hotel I showed you. And I talked to him one day and he said, you know what really hurts? When my father was working for the government of Zimbabwe, we used to take family vacations and I stayed in the peninsula. He had so much money from being corrupt and stealing money from Zimbabwe citizens that we could stay in this expensive hotel. I remember that. And now I sleep outside because my family went against Mugabe. Yeah. I mean, an amazing story. But the point is that most of these people aren't trying to be something they're not. They've tasted this. And this, of course, is the great tragedy of much of the developing world, that you've got this rich upper crust and you've got the poor, and they ignore each other. And over again in my travels, I see this. I mean, here I am in New Delhi, drinking whiskey with a philosophy professor from the University of New Delhi. He could be my brother. We're talking about the same things. He lives in the same world I live in. But he and the person who cleans the toilet are in a different world, and they have no recognition of one another. So there's an enormous tragedy here. You're absolutely right. The tragedy is the fact that in the developing world, you've got 90% of people or 80% of people without enough to eat or barely enough to get by. That's a tragedy. But here in Chungking Mansions, you don't see very much of that. You see a few people, and I have seen a few glimpses of tragedy sometimes, but not as much as you might think. I have seen bad things. I saw one guy who told me he'd been sold into slavery. I saw a woman, an Indonesian woman, raffled off to the highest buyer. Stuff that's very unpleasant that I saw briefly and couldn't intervene in for complicated reasons. I saw an Indonesian woman dying of AIDS because she was infected by her Ghanaian boyfriend, and there are grim things going on. Overall, though, this is, as I said earlier, a club of the successful, and they are successful. They're middle class. My class of asylum seekers are smarter than my students at Chinese University of Hong Kong. Clearly, hands down, these are the equivalent of PhD students in Chinese University of Hong Kong. That's amazing. These guys have nothing. But I remember my first class teaching them. I was talking about something, and somebody raised his hand and said, "Professor, there are 5 things wrong with what you just said. Number 1, number 2, number 3. I can't do that." And he was smart enough to do it. These guys know everything, it seems. This amazing amount of knowledge that comes from this. This is true not of everybody in Chungking Mansions. You have a variety of different backgrounds, but it is people who have tasted the better things in life to a large degree. Now, we go back to some of the questions that were raised in my first paper earlier today of who talks to me. And you're right that the people who have, in your implication anyway, the people who have the confidence to talk to a white professor, as I became known, are probably those who are more self-confident. So I probably have talked to people who are a little more successful. If somebody is a trader and is quite rich, and, hey, I'll go over and talk to that professor, he'd want to know from me. Whereas some Ghanaian guy who's just lost all his money, age 22, going home in shame, he won't want to talk. And so there is a certain degree of bias there, I grant you. But overall, this is the way the place seems to work, and I don't think these people are in an illusion. Where the moral issue is they're making their money by exploiting their fellows. And the more successful they are, by some accounts anyway, the more they will be ripping off their fellows back home. That is a moral problem, but I can't really judge this directly because I don't exactly know how true this is. I can't tell.
Thanks.
Does that answer your question? Okay, yeah.
More questions? Just to follow up your comment, actually, well, maybe I'm too much a supporter of Baudrillard or Guy Debord, but I was thinking that the simulacra works pretty good in this because, well, we are talking about fake stuff, and also this is a simulacra experience. Well, there is the experience, some tourists you mentioned are looking for this exotic experience, no? Just to try to connect this with one of the issues that I read on the PowerPoint, but you couldn't mention because of time. I read that you were working also with Goffman, and I guess the faces theory and the theory of the dramatic approach, no? I love how you work on micropolitics because this is real anthropology, you know, how you engage the voices of the informants, how you engage the field work. How are you working or using this idea of Goffman, of the faces of the dramatical approach, and also this idea of the illusions or a dramatical approach, maybe, no? We can say, a kind of arena or a scenario, a public scenario where the roles are represented and people can guess the status of the other and take decisions that are practical decisions that affect their pocket, no, their money.
Yeah, that's an extraordinarily good question. I deliberately don't bring in Goffman that much. Okay. But the key is the idea you just mentioned of micro-interactions. And you see this all the time. I mean, you guys do it too in daily life. You meet somebody for the first time. You talk to your professor about a bad grade, for example, which you may be thinking about now. You meet somebody for the first time on a date. The issue of micro-interactions and how you present yourself is extraordinarily important. What do you do? How do you behave? And these guys are thinking about this all the time. How do you present yourself exactly? Because the stakes in these interactions can be absolutely huge. Whether you are successful in a 20-second interaction might determine whether you are rich in the future or whether you go back in abject failure. So always this has to be looked at. And I bring in Goffman particularly because almost all globalization theory is at too high a level. It doesn't deal with individuals. And when it does deal with individuals, it deals with them only in one place. So that, you know, the Caribbean importers of these goods, or the Brazilians who do this, and so on and so on and so on. It doesn't look at these interactions with people from different cultures getting together and how they interact. And I think Goffman is absolutely key here because he enables you to look at these cross-cultural interactions. One thing that's happened to anthropology is it doesn't deal anymore with cross-cultural interactions. I mean, it's strange talking to ordinary people because they might take an introduction to anthropology and think, well, I want to learn how I can interact with Chinese. I want to learn how I can interact with Brazilians. I want to learn what Turkish people are like. You don't learn that much these days. And this approach, without being too naive about it, is one way of getting at that. What do you need to know in dealing back and forth? And this is constantly what you need to see. One more story, because it's too good not to tell. I remember seeing a Nigerian guy. I was talking to him. And he saw in the Saturday night, you know, where everybody is walking by, a Hong Kong girl, a very attractive Hong Kong girl with a short skirt. And he'd never spoken to her before. So he ran after her and he said, I love you, I love you. And she screamed and ran away. He ran after her just to try and tell her he loved her. And, you know, this is the kind of thing, I finally had to pull him back and say, don't, she's going to call the police, don't do this. This is the kind of occasion that goes on, and it's because of a failed micro-interaction, because of a lack of cultural understanding. You see this over and over again. One public service activity I had to do in Chungking Mansions was to get involved with the police to try and establish an African community so that when these kinds of things happened, some Africans would be able to explain to the police what happened culturally, why this goes on. And fortunately, it's been very effective when this kind of thing happens, because you don't want to have these Africans put in jail for 5 years for attempted rape. That can happen simply because of a cross-cultural misunderstanding. So Goffman is important theoretically, but it's also just important on a pure, microscopic, day-to-day level. This happens all the time. How do you deal with these people of radically different cultures? Which is exactly what you see going on here. And, you know, this is what anthropology at the most basic level should be, I would think.
Totally agree, yeah. Okay, more question, guys. Actually, we have to finish, so more questions? No? Yes, go ahead.
Quick question, I mean, what languages did you use to communicate with people in their English? What's
Okay,
more? I mean, most of them for sure know English because they are not in the lowest.
Yeah. I mean, this research, I entered this research by accident in a sense, because Chungking Mansions was interesting. You know, I was talking to Bly about somebody doing research in the Gothic area of Barcelona or the Raval area of Barcelona. You know, he's not a specialist in this. I'm not a specialist in Africa, South Asia. I don't know this stuff, but here's a building. Somebody's got to do it. That's all. But my languages are spectacularly unsuited for this. Japanese is worthless, and that's my best language. I do remember one day speaking to a Bangladeshi trader and a Ghanaian trader. The Bangladeshi was studying in a Japanese university, and the Ghanaian had worked in Japan for 4 years, and we began speaking in Japanese. Within about 30 seconds, we had a crowd of 50 people around us wondering, what the hell are you saying? What language are you talking in? I mean, it was distinctly weird. There are other languages that keep coming up, but English is the lingua franca. Cantonese, my other language, is pretty worthless. Now, it's not worthless. One thing I didn't talk about was the Owners Association, which is almost all Chinese, mainland Chinese. And they know nothing about Chungking Mansions. And so there's this enormous cross-cultural gap between them and what goes on in Chungking Mansions. The head of the Owners Association once told me that she felt all the Africans were dealing in heroin because when they shake hands, you know how Africans would shake hands with a snap and all of that, they must have packets of heroin in their hands. That's the kind of misunderstanding that goes on. So it's quite interesting to see that gap. Cantonese doesn't help because she doesn't speak English. And my book is entitled Ghetto at the Center of the World. That's kind of a negative title. But because she and nobody in the ownership committee knows English, they'll never know. And there's a book launch in Chungking Mansion's owners. They have 150 copies of the book. Buying this, they don't understand what I say in there about them. Now, I did make it easier. I did say nicer things about them than I otherwise would, but that's part of the issue here. Language, Cantonese gets you nowhere, except among the guards and the ownership committee, and they're not around. I think if I was doing language only for this, the dominant language I would have learned would have been Urdu Hindi, because it would have opened all the Pakistani Indian doors. But after all, most of the Indians I know in Pakistani speak Punjabi, and others speak Tamil. So you've got a gap there. Among the Africans, Swahili would have helped, but there too, they're not speaking Swahili very often, they're speaking various dialects. I've seen two traders deal, and first they'll try speaking in a dialect, no. Then they might move to Swahili, no. Then they'll move to English. And so there's just like you might do. I mean, Catalan to Spanish to English if necessary. It's the same kind of game. So in a sense, I'm unanthropological to do this whole thing in English. But I don't think I ever met anybody who wasn't able to communicate here, really. If you go into mainland China, in Guangzhou, Mandarin Chinese becomes important. And I think the people who come to Chungking Mansions are self-selected in the sense of those whose English is better. I have seen a few people whose English is bad enough so they only type in numbers in a calculator. And you can do that. Phone, 92, 89, 90. And you see that going on in a calculator. For the most part, though, people are amazingly articulate in English, even if it's not exactly perfect. I've had no problem with this. So Chungking Mansions, in this sense, goes against all the anthropological maxims that we know. You've got to speak in the native speaker's language. You can't do it here because you've got 90 different languages and you can't learn them all. So this is one place, again, where English was possible to use here.
I just want to say that, sadly, when we meet someone who looks foreigner, we don't start by Catalan, Spanish, and English. We start from Spanish only.
Spanish only, and that makes sense, yeah. Nobody speaks Catalan, really. Is that sad, by the way?
Yeah.
Why is it sad?
Sorry?
Why is that sad?
Yeah,
Sad.
¿Por qué triste?
yeah, because we can start by speaking Catalan. I mean, well, my mother tongue is Spanish, but anyway, I mean, I'm in favor of that thing. Yeah, just mention that everyone can make their own conclusions.
Okay, but one way to look at that, in Chungking Mansions, what Pakistanis and Indians always tell me is, why should I bother to learn Cantonese? Cantonese is not important. It's only spoken by 100 million people. I should learn English and send my kid to the UK. If I was, say, a Pakistani or a Filipino living in Raval, I might have the same thought. Why should I learn Catalan? Spanish is spoken all over Latin America. I can use Spanish. Catalan is of this area only, and I'm not going to be here forever. What would you say?
Well, it depends on your future prospects. Sure. I mean, if you're going to live here, just learn Catalan, that's all. I mean, it's quite simple.
And it's a good answer. If you're going to stay here, yeah, learn it. So, yeah.
Last week we had a lecture with our Japanese teacher, and she was doing some research about Japanese people living here. Most of them are living here only for maybe 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, because they've been sent by their companies there in Japan, and then they were coming back. And she said that they think just the same. They think, why do I have to bother about learning Catalan, because I'm going to stay here for maybe 3 years or 4. Maybe Spanish is going to be a good thing to have in my CV, you know, because maybe I will use it for work or whatever, but I'm not going to use Catalan anymore. So it's exactly what you said about Cantonese, about giving preference to learning English before Cantonese is what they think when they come here. And I can understand it. I mean, it's obvious.
Yeah, and, you know, I don't mean to go against Catalan pride, which is a wonderful thing. I mean, clearly Catalan's highly important for you guys. It's Catalan identity.
Yeah,
it's the
we're
basis
talking about pragmatic decisions.
Exactly. Now, the pragmatics get in the way sometimes. I know one 14-year-old Pakistani kid who grew up in Hong Kong, and he said, I want to be a policeman or a fireman. That's my dream. He can't ever do it because he can't read and write Chinese. He will be permanently in the Chungking Mansions, basically. He can't get out because he doesn't have the linguistic skills to survive in the society. So it's often a self-defeating way of looking at it, not to learn Cantonese, but that's what you see to an extraordinary extent. You know, language is so strange in Hong Kong because if you're like me, you can speak English only. Whenever I speak Cantonese to people, they reply in English. If you're a poor Pakistani, on the other hand,
that happens
you
in
need
Japan
Cantonese.
too.
But it's clearly unjust. If you're rich and white, English. If you're poor and brown, no. You got to know the local language.
Yeah, but that happens in, I don't know, in Japan. They come to me saying, America Jin, and I don't think I look like an American. Maybe from South California, something like that, but yeah, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
I mean,
although in Japan, English terrifies everyone. Well, not
Yeah,
exactly, but still.
We can talk for hours on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have to finish. As you can see, we train our students in loving the language diversity. So, so thank you very much, Professor Gordon Mathews, for visiting us. It was an honor. It was a privilege to have your lecture. It was a long day for you to lecture in the same day. We are taking too much advantage of you, maybe. So thank you so much, and well, thank you. It was an illuminating, very revelating conference. Also, not only because only on the topic of Chungking mentions, also on how anthropology works. No, that this is important also for our students. So, thank you very much for coming here, and thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gordon, how are you? Are you tired?
No, fine.
Okay.
I can watch it.
We can take a coffee now or... Okay, I go to bring that back. Ok, bé, perfecte. Estem una mica cansats ja.